Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Postorino, and I'm going to be your host for today's webinar. And really what we're going to talk about, we're going to have a fireside chat with Mark Cravotta from Keeper Security. We're going to talk about preparing and responding to a breach. This is just one of the webinars that we provide here at Flycast Partners. So if you have an opportunity, please go to our website. You can look at some of the content and some of the things that we provide, from an education base. And please take a look at some of those items. And if you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out. I do have one housekeeping item that I'd like to convey to everybody, that if you have any questions during the conversation or during the webinar, if you can please put them in the chat box down at the bottom of the go-to webinar screen, and then we'll answer those questions if we have time. If we run out of time, what we'll do is we'll take those questions internally and we'll respond back to you via email. So we can just continue this flow of conversation with Mark. So one of the things I really want to talk about is the importance of an incident response plan. And you can go out on the internet and read about this extensively, but for mostly when you're inside an organization, a lot of organizations don't necessarily consider incident response plan as being something critical to the welfare of the organization until you have a breach or an outage, of course. And so one of the things that we want to talk about, or we're going to talk to Mark about, he's the subject matter expert, is really the importance of an incident response plan, the steps taken to put together a plan, the steps taken when you're actually going through a breach, and identify the good and the bad, not so much good, but mostly bad. And then we're going to talk about if it's password related, what are the steps taken, because that's something unique to a breach, and we could talk about that, and Mark will go in a little bit more detail about that also. But so not to waste any more time, today I want to welcome Mark Cravotta, who's the Chief Revenue Officer of Keeper Security. He's responsible for sales strategy, revenue of the company. He's got over 20 years experience in cybersecurity and technical sales experience. And then prior to joining Keeper, Mark was the Chief Revenue Officer of Cravotta, and that's a leading incident response firm, and it was recently acquired by Palo Alto Networks. And Mark has a mechanical engineer degree from the United States Military Academy at West Point, big deal, and an MBA from Charleston Southern University. So Mark, thank you, sir, for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Thanks, John. It's good to be here. Appreciate it.
So, and we could just jump right into the content. And one of the things that, again, I know from my experience, this was one of the hardest things especially from a large organization, try to put these types of things together and try to put your arms or your head around what's required. And you could hire consulting firms, and you could try to do it internally, and you could read everything on the internet. But So from your perspective, can you just tell all of us, like, what is the importance of an incident response plan?
Yeah, I mean, the essence of the importance is that you don't want to be planning or figuring things out in the middle of an emergency. You talked about an outage or a breach. That is a very, very chaotic and unnerving event, whether you don't have access to your systems to do your job, whether your customers are impacted, your employees, whether sensitive information has been compromised. There's all kinds of ramifications, both financial, operational, and even potentially legal. And depending on the organization, it could ultimately impact other things like, people's well-being. Think about the medical industry and losing access to critical life systems and things like that. So the plan is important. The detail of the plan and the the essence of the plan, it can't just be something that's just done, for the sake of compliance. It has to be well thought out so that it can be executed. We talked about my military experience, and one thing we do is we drill, so that when real things start happening, that you're prepared, and that you're not experiencing something for the first time. You've been through that testing, you've been through that training, you understand what your roles are, and you're able to execute. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge for people, is they're not ready to execute in the face of a data breach.
So in your experience, when in say your previous life with Cravotta and then now your current life with Keeper, like most of the people or can you, even a percentage of the people that you talk to on a daily basis, like how many of them really don't have a plan or don't have an idea about a plan?
Most of them. I mean, honestly, people are caught off guard. I got a call from a friend the other morning, frantic, 6:30 in the morning. I was on my way to Dubai, and he's like, "We've been breached. What do we do?" And thankfully, he knew I was, came from the industry and was able to get on the phone with their executive team and walk them through, like, do you have insurance? Have you filed a claim? Have you notified anybody? And then kind of took them through the steps. So it's really important to understand. And I don't think people understand, just what's involved, and until they get that, that symbol on their screen that says you've been breached, and then it's pretty much a panic exercise. There are very sophisticated firms that have, incident response practices, but even then, when it really happens, I mean, you think of some of these really high profile breaches, you don't expect to be, attacked by a nation state. You don't expect to have everything you own shut down, especially when you've taken measures to prevent it. So, I think there are various stages of plans. The majority of the people out there, especially in the, your common organizations, whether it's a small organization or, a shop run by a handful of IT and security personnel, you're not really ready for that breach until it happens, unless you're really drilling. And it takes a lot of experience. And, I will tell you that, we probably at the Crypsis group last year, I think in our published report, we had probably 2,000 ransomware incidents that we responded to. And I can tell you, those are urgent. I mean, they're minutes, seconds response. That's one thing that group prided themselves on, was being able to respond in minutes, because every minute is urgent when it comes to somebody holding your company ransom.
So so if I'm a new person within an IT department in a large organization, or any organization really, and I need to put together an incident response plan. Can you
Yep.
from a high level walk me through the steps on, like,
Sure.
what, just put our head around what it takes to put a plan together?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing is a cohesive leadership team, because I think, when we think about what happens in an organization, you got to assemble your leaders. And, that's everybody from the CEO on down, because there's this concept of authority. Anything like that is super sensitive, and that nobody wants to talk about it. So everybody freezes, because you could say the wrong thing, right? So you have, legal ramifications, you have all kinds of ramifications. So it's important to pull together your leadership team, and that's what I call identifying resources. Who's going to do what? Who's responsible? Who's going to know? And then how are you going to assemble? The main step is what we call incident identification and first response. So the idea of, how do we even know we've been attacked? Sometimes it's really obvious. You have, a ransom note, or, you get a call or something like that. Other times, you think, hey, something's not right here, and this looks like a breach, and we need to investigate it. And, that starts the clock on a lot of things that are, required from a compliance perspective, especially if you have sensitive information. Like, you have X number of hours to notify those that are impacted. First thing you got to do is figure that out. So incident ID and first response is critical. What are you going to do? And what are your resources? It's really important to identify the roles and responsibilities that everyone's going to play. Who's going to be the communicator? Who's going to dig in? Who is point? Somebody has to run point on the incident itself. You can't have too many hands going. And what are your communication strategies? How often are you going to meet? Who are you going to talk to in the outside world? Those kinds of things. Do you have insurance? What's that process look like? Because cyber insurance, and I'll talk a little bit about that, is super critical, because that they come with resources that are skilled at this. There's one thing to be able to work through an incident on your own. There's another thing to be able to deal with a professional threat actor who's doing this for a living, and collecting millions and millions of dollars of ransom, on a regular basis. They're skilled, and you've got to be skilled in talking to them. The next step, or the one thing I'd want to put in an incident response plan, is some form of detection or analysis tool. So that people can know ahead of time. It's how do I get alerted that I've been breached? And there are tools out there. A lot of the incident response companies have tools. Palo Alto has a tool. They're called managed detection and response tools, MDR tools. CrowdStrike has a tool. We at Keeper use those tools to detect and respond. The next stage is how do you contain it, eradicate it, and recover from it? And that really is a fluid situation depending on the nature. It's you think of any emergency response, containing it. How big is it? How widespread is it? How drastic is it? How do you eradicate it? Do I even know how? Do I have to bring in third-party resources? Who are those people? And then how do you recover? And then I think the last step is always retrospective. Looking back and saying, how did this happen? How can we prevent it from happening again? And then, outside communications and things like that. So those are the things that I think about when I think about really assembling an incident response plan. And then there's a lot of details that go into each aspect of that, John.
Okay, thank you. And some of the things that you said, cyber insurance, and I know that it's I'm not saying necessarily difficult to get, but obviously your premiums can be very much dictated based upon your incident response plan and some of the other things, your maturity of the organization.
Mm-hmm.
Can you, and I don't know, I know you want to talk about that, and I hope I didn't steal any thunder from you, but
No.
Can you talk a little bit about the importance of cyber insurance related to incident response, please?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I think cyber insurance is essential because people aren't equipped to afford huge ransoms. And so, the ransom far outweighs any premium that you're going to pay. And, so there's that. I mean, there's the idea that, you're going to get, coverage, but you're also going to get, one of the things that you get is what's called a breach coach and an incident response firm. So the insurance companies have relationships with law firms and incident response firms that are super skilled at doing these negotiations. And so as a client who's breached, you say, I have no idea, I've been hacked. They're like, don't do a thing, we'll handle the whole thing. And they work on your behalf. This is like, what calling in the expertise to do a ransom and things like that. So when that kind of a thing goes on, you want to make sure you've got experts talking to your threat actor. I mean, making a wrong step can cause your ransom to double. Not knowing how to apply a decryption key. I mean, you haven't seen these before. There's a lot of skills to this. So, it's the idea of having insurance and the resources that are associated with it and having professionals respond to it is really important. It's worth every penny, in my opinion, to have. And it's not that expensive. It's just, it really is an essential. And so, like I said, when my friend called the other morning, it's the first thing I asked him, and lo and behold, they had insurance. They filed their claim immediately, and within an hour, an incident response firm was assigned to that matter, and they were resolved in just a couple of days. That's really how it ought to go. And again, that's for a ransom event. I mean, we have other maybe less critical events that we can talk about how do we resolve them internally. But in the worst case, a ransom event, those are things that I always recommend.
Okay, thank you. And something you said earlier, when you walk through kind of the steps or the outline, the framework of a plan. So, and you said something earlier too, in the military, you always train as you fight. And it's repetition, and it's always boots on ground that is where you're going to get the best feedback. So if I look at, if I say there's a breach within the organization, could you potentially walk through like, and again, now you gave us the steps of the outline of a plan, but actually like doing the execution part of a plan if a breach occurs?
Sure. So, I mean, and I've kind of walked through a little bit of that. So if a breach occurs, and again, it depends on what the breach is. I mean, the first thing you want to do is identify it. I mean, you have to figure out that you've been breached, and then figure out what the scope of that breach is. So that's the first thing that you want to do is figure out, okay, what's been compromised and how am I going to respond to that? The next immediate step is to contain it. Stop the breach. Cease network traffic. Lock that down and really start to figure that out. Depending on the nature of it, you may have to do some communication, because there's compliance information that says if you are aware of a breach, you have under PCI or HIPAA, you have 72 hours to notify. Some contracts have a 24-hour window, so you've got to notify people of a suspected breach. And in order not to overstep, you got to know what the scope of that is, because you don't want to tell people they've been breached when they haven't. So I mean, it's very important to be able to understand that. The next step is really that eradication. How are you going to resolve it? In a password breach, it's different than a ransomware, and we'll talk about how to respond and recover from a password breach, but how are you going to eradicate it and recover from it? And then, what are you going to do about the follow-up with that? So sometimes you have to do credit monitoring, notification, those types of things, depending on the nature of what's happened. Sometimes it may be caught early, like in a password breach. If you have the right tools, and we'll talk about that, you may be able to respond very quickly to that before there's damage, before information is stolen, before people log in. So there's some of that goes on, and the quicker the better. So obviously the sooner you identify and respond, the less likelihood that the damage is going to be as bad as if it is left untended.
One of the things that you just talked about, and you said obviously a ransomware attack is different than a password breach. Sure. Can you talk a little bit about the password breach and the importance of some of the things that you're definitely familiar with, please?
Yeah, I mean, and the best way to not have a password breach is to not have a password breach. So I mean, it's that's one of the things. There's a lot of upfront stuff that you can do, and using a password management platform or other identity management tools like two-factor, et cetera, are really important. But long, complex passwords that aren't known to the individual, what we call zero knowledge, is obviously the best way to go. But let's say you do have a password breach and you have some kind of indication that your password's been compromised. The first thing you want to do is change it. I mean, immediately change that password and make sure that it's updated to something complex that isn't already been used. I mean, it's a unique, complex password. That in itself is going to stop anybody from using the password. So to the extent that it's been distributed, the new password is going to solve for some of that. You want to make sure that you have multi-factor enabled immediately if you hadn't previously, because one of the things about using a password is it requires a second factor, like a token or a biometric or something like that. You're able to further stop the attack. So those things are important. We talked about the idea of analysis. So a tool like Keeper's Breach Watch, to be able to look in the dark web to see if the password's actually been compromised, is important. So a set of credentials that say, hey, this is my user ID, this is my password, are they present on the dark web? Having a dark web tool that is certainly complete enough from an end-to-end perspective. We have over 24 million records on the dark web. There are tools out there that kind of look at it and don't give you a sense of truly the complete scope of what's out there. So it's important that any provider you have spends the right amount of money on the correct and current database. But those are the things that you really want to do in order to contain a password breach. And then obviously if it's been compromised, then you need to look into, all right, it's been compromised, then you got to start to do the analysis of what's been accessed with those credentials and has anything been stolen, and that kind of enters into that incident response process.
So from your role, obviously with Crypt System and now with Keeper, can you talk a little bit about the strength of Keeper and some of the things that are offered to the end users or to organizations to hopefully eliminate some of the things that we're discussing today?
Sure. I mean, first and foremost, we have data that shows that 81% of ransomware attacks or password-related breaches, come from the actual credential itself, compromised credentials, people giving up their password. We're all notorious at, very unsophisticated passwords that have all kinds of personal information. We're answering surveys on Facebook, and it's easy to guess these passwords. And, most of us have been breached enough times through our day-to-day walk that a lot of those credentials that people are using are present on the dark web, and we become numb to it. So, Keeper allows individuals and businesses to have a seamless platform to be able to generate complex passwords in what we call a zero trust, zero knowledge fashion. Zero trust, and the keeper doesn't store that information or have it available to them. So as a provider, we can't possibly give away your information. But zero knowledge from your side, in that I don't know any of my passwords. I use Keeper to generate my passwords. They're so complex, and I launch all the applications from the Keeper app itself that I don't know what they are. So if somebody were to call me and say, hey, what's your password for site X, or text me, I couldn't, because I don't know what they are. I share my passwords using the Keeper Vault seamlessly with other Keeper users. For instance, my son today is a college student, and he's updated his password on his college site. He has shared the credential with me so that I can pay his tuition through Keeper, and nobody in the outside world knows what that password is. He's generated it through the tool. It's a complex password, but there's a lot of personal information there at the university that could be compromised, to include bank account to pay for tuition things. I mean, I hope somebody could pay that tuition for me, but you understand the nature of that thing. So that's what we do, and that's how we do it. And then we support other identity tools like single sign-on and multi-factor, and we embed those in our tools so that it's one place to go and access the entire identity stack. So you don't have to go look up your two-factor code in another app. It'll fill it in on that website for you. You just tell it which one you're using, and it'll generate it and auto-fill the entire thing. So it's a really seamless experience. It's something that I think that all people, businesses, and individuals should have. I mean, passwords are not going away, and they're too easy to guess, and they're too hard. You know as well as I do that the more complex the organization makes the password requirement, the more often we forget. I probably go to the same site 60 times, and if I don't have it in Keeper, I'm always hitting the forgot password function. And so, those kinds of things are really important. We're just not wired to be able to generate, remember complex passwords. And so we need tools to do it. This one is very straightforward and very easy to use, and it's designed for that.
So from an implementation standpoint, and if this is something, obviously it's something critical for your incident response plan, is to have a tool like this involved or part of your solution, you're part of your plan. So if I was going to implement this cold from greenfield, let's say, what would it take from a duration standpoint to potentially get a Keeper, your Keeper security up and running within my organization?
Yeah, we can set it up in a few hours actually. So it's designed for seamless integration to organizations' current identity stack, whether it's single sign-on or some form of directory service like Azure. So I mean, it's got an out-of-the-box integration to all those tools. It auto imports passwords from either other tools that you might have, spreadsheets, websites. So it goes in and says, I see you've stored your password on Google at these 70 websites. It'll bring them into the tool. It'll also do an immediate analysis of what's compromised on the dark web and say you should change these credentials, and then offer to help you change them. So it can be stood up pretty quickly. We also offer full end user training, and we make that unlimited so that as users need to adopt the tool, and some are more sophisticated than others, we'll work with them to help them get stood up and improve their security posture of the organization and themselves. So it's not a hard process. The tool is designed to be super simple to use, which is great, because the reality of it is none of us have the capacity to handle something super complex. We hear about tools like privilege access. Those are amazing tools, but they're designed for very specific use cases, what we call insiders or insider threats. But they're also managed and run by very seasoned IT professionals who are used to dealing with complex systems. Keeper's much more simple than that. It still handles a lot of that functionality that privilege access might do for an organization, but it's designed for the end user, and it's designed to be seamless.
Okay. You said something earlier about Breach Watch. And you talked about a monitoring tool. Can you talk a little bit more about Breach Watch, please?
Sure. What BreachWatch does is it takes all the credentials that you have in the Keeper Vault and all the compromised password combinations, user ID and password that are present on the dark web. Like I said, over 24 million records. And in a zero knowledge, zero trust format, i.e. they're both hashed, so they're encrypted and hashed, they're compared. And when there's a record that's on the dark web and one in your vault that match, unbeknownst to anybody except the algorithm, it says you have a breach credential. So it doesn't expose what the credential is. It just says this password combination is present on the dark web. You should change it. Let us help you.
So Mark, from your perspective, is there anything else that you think, based upon the things that we talked, and again, this was incident response 101. It was very high level. Not a lot, we didn't go down into the deep crevices of an incident response plan. But is there anything else that you think is relevant that you'd like to convey to the people listening to our webcast today?
Yeah, I mean, obviously a good, well-rounded identity solution is important. So there's no silver bullet. So think about some kind of directory service where you can actively control who's in your organization. A password management platform like a Keeper, two-factor authentication, proper security training, phishing training, etc. Those types of things are super important. I also think it's important for an organization, for business, to run vulnerability tests regularly and penetration tests that can test the physical controls and boundaries of your network and your various systems. They'll find the vulnerable points of entry. So, remember, passwords are one point of entry, one vector, if you will. A network that has holes in it is certainly another one. So those are really important. And then, if you really want to take it a step further, what we call is red team or tabletop exercises, where we actually simulate a breach. That's on your incident response firms can do that, where they actually simulate the breach within your organization. They test those vulnerabilities, and then you get to test your incident response plan in real time. So, those are great exercises in terms of readiness, and I think they're really important because nobody is susceptible to a breach. No matter what we do, there's always those that are going to try to find their way in, and it's just not incredibly seamless and hack proof. There's always going to be some vulnerability, especially because our systems are changing all the time. I do recommend people to have confidence, but to take the steps. I mean, they're well documented out there. Sometimes hackers can go for the low-hanging fruit, the organizations that don't have two-factor authentication. So, one of the biggest sources of breaches that I worked over the last couple of years with our team was what we call email compromise. And, this is for web-based email that doesn't have two-factor authentication. And that second factor, eliminates the majority of those breaches, but it's amazing how many people haven't turned it on because it's a nuisance. Hey, I don't want to do that. That's what Keeper does. It allows you to just log in, it'll enter it for you. So the nice thing is, yeah, it is a bit of friction or nuisance, if you will, but if you have a tool that looks it up for you and puts it in automatically in a millisecond, you never know what happened, you're more secure, and you haven't had to slow down. You can just log in and you'll never know the difference that you've actually entered those credentials. So tools can help. We're designed to make it frictionless and to make it easy on you to be more secure. But you can't bypass it. If you lock your front door and leave your garage open, someone's going to come in, and it's just that easy. So you really have to be vigilant and lock down everything that you can.
Well, I surely appreciate the discussion we had today, Mark, and for everybody else listening, you can see there's a lot that goes into incident response. There's a lot that goes into preparing your organization for something that is most likely going to occur at some time within your organization. And as Mark said earlier, Keeper, obviously they have a great tools out there. If you have any questions or anything you'd like to discuss regarding Keeper security or Flycast, please don't hesitate to reach out. I mean, that's what we're here for. But Mark, I want to say thank you very much for your time today, and I apologize for my dogs.
No worries.
And again, for everybody else listening, we want to thank you for your time, taking time out of your busy day to learn, about incident response. But also, again, go out to look at our website at flycast.com, flycastpartners.com, and just take a look at some of the things that we're doing to help really educate people about security and some other things associated with IT. So in saying that, I want to say again, Mark, thank you. Keeper, thank you. Keeper Security, thank you. And please enjoy your day. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, John.